So, Unit 5 review. Number 1 says select all expressions whose value is negative. So in A, we have negative 15 divided by 4. B, 15 divided by negative 4. C, negative 15 divided by negative 4. D, negative 8 times 3/4. Or E, negative 8 times negative 3/4. You're selecting all expressions whose value is negative. So for A, we have a negative divided by positive. So negative divided by positive. You should remember that that would equal a negative. B, we have positive divided by negative, which also equals a negative. C, we have negative divided by negative, which is a positive. D, we have negative times positive, which is negative. And E, we have negative times negative, which is positive. So to select all expressions whose value is negative, our answer would be A, B, and D. So remember, when you're working with two numbers with multiplication and division, if the signs are the same, your answer is positive. If they're different, your answer will be negative. Or if there's an odd number of negatives, your answer is negative. An even number of negatives means your answer will be positive. On number 2, it says a sunken ship is resting at 3,000 feet below sea level. Directly above the ship, a whale is swimming 1,960 feet below sea level. Directly above the ship and the whale is a plane flying at 8,500 feet above sea level. Select the true statement. A, the distance between the heights of the whale and the plane is negative 10,460 feet. B, the difference in height between the whale and the plane is 10,460 feet. C, the difference in height between the whale and the ship is negative 1,040 feet. D, the distance between the heights of the whale and the ship is 1,040 feet. You're selecting the true statement. Okay, so let's think about this situation. So if we represent sea level as 0, we know we have a ship that is 3,000 feet below sea level, so it'll be negative 3,000. So here's our ship. And then 1,960 feet below sea level. 1,960 feet. We have a whale. And then 8,550 feet above sea level. 8,500, I think I said 50. 8,500 feet above sea level. We have our plane. Okay, so A says the distance between the heights of the whale and the plane is negative 10,460 feet. Well, if you remember distance, so that's like you're traveling a distance and you cannot travel a negative distance. So since this is negative, we know A cannot be a true statement. On B, it says the difference in height between the whale and the plane is 10,460 feet. So since it says between the whale and the plane, we would list the whale first. So the whale is located at negative 1,960. And difference means subtract, so minus. The plane is located at 8,500 feet. So if you subtract those, you would get negative 10,460. Because this would be the same thing as saying negative 1,960 plus negative 8,500, which would still be negative 10,460 feet. because the well is 10,460 feet below the plane. So since this is a positive, that one is not true. On C, it says the difference in height between the well and the ship is negative 1,040 feet. So again, the well is negative 1,960 feet minus the ship, which is at negative 3,000 feet. Well, here I'm subtracting a negative. So if I rewrite as addition, I would have negative 1,960. Change to addition and then use the opposite of negative 3,000, which would be positive 3,000. So that would give me positive 1,040 feet because the well is 1,040 feet above the ship. So since this gives us a negative answer, my answer is not C, which means it must be D. And D says the distance between the heights of the well and the ship is 1,040 feet. And since my distance is positive, I know that's a good sign. So it's just asking for the distance. So sign is positive as we found here. So that means D is true. Number 3, it says let X represent negative 5/6 and Y equals positive 4/3. So here we have a number line. And I want you to select all of the expressions that have a positive value. So you don't even necessarily have to solve these expressions. You just have to figure out which ones would have a positive value. So let's look at A, which says X times Y. So we see X over here, which is a negative. So that's negative times Y, which is a positive. And I know a negative times a positive is a negative. B says Y divided by X, so that gives me a positive divided by a negative, which would also be a negative answer. For C, X divided by Y, that's just like B, except the opposite. So negative divided by a positive. And since I have one of each sign, that means my answer is negative. On D, we have X plus Y. So I can't just use negative plus positive and know what my answer will be, because remember, it depends on the absolute value. So let's look at negative 5/6. The absolute value of negative 5/6 just means what is the distance from 0. So it is 5/6 of a unit from 0. And then we have 4/3. The absolute value for that is 4/3. Sometimes it might be hard to compare fractions that have different denominators. So we could create an equivalent fraction. And since 6 is a multiple of 3, I know 3 times 2 is 6. So therefore I have to multiply the numerator by the same thing. And 4 times 2 is 8. So basically I have 5/6 and 8/6. And since 8/6 is larger than 5/6, that means my positive is larger than my negative. So my negative is less than my positive, which means my negative plus my positive is going to give me a positive answer. So D will have a positive answer. E, X minus Y. So that would give me negative 5/6 minus 4/3. So if I have a negative and then I subtract a positive, that means I'm just going further negative. And then F, Y minus X. So now I have 4/3 minus negative 5/6. And if I rewrote that expression, that would give me 4/3. So let's change it to addition so we can compare easier. So if I switch to addition, I have to use the opposite of my second value. So the opposite of negative 5/6 is positive 5/6. And a positive plus a positive will give me a positive answer. So both D and F would have a positive value. So on a problem like this, you do not have to actually solve these. You can just use the rules that we've learned to determine if your answer should be positive or negative. Erase a little bit of that. Okay, number 4 says calculate the value of each expression. So this time you'll actually be finding the answer. So A says 60 minus negative 80. When we have subtraction, it's best to always rewrite as addition. So that would mean 60 plus the opposite of negative 80 is positive 80. So 60 plus 80. 108 plus 6 is 14. So my answer would be 140. On B, I have 2.3 plus negative 4.9, or negative 4.9. Well, if you remember the YouTube video we watched, when you're adding a positive and negative, you can just find the difference and keep the sign of the larger number. So if I look at just the number, so 2.3 and 4.9, 4.9 is larger, so I know my answer is going to be negative. And then I can just subtract. So 4.9 minus 2.3. 9 minus 3 is 6. Our decimal just carries down. And 4 minus 2 is 2. So the difference is 2.6, but since the larger number had a negative sign, then my answer is negative 2.6. On C, so again, we're adding a positive and negative, but looking at our two numbers, they're the exact same. So if I compare those, they're both equal, which means I'm adding opposites, which tells me my answer is going to be 0. On number 5, it wants you to solve each equation. So here, you can use the additive inverse or the multiplicative inverse. So let's look at the first one. We have negative 5a equals negative 0.2. So that means negative 5 times a equals negative 0.2. So since this is a multiplication problem, that means I could use the multiplicative inverse. So since I'm multiplying by negative 5, then I would want to multiply by the inverse, which would be multiplying by the reciprocal. So negative 5 times negative 1/5. I know negative 1/5 times negative 5 would just give me a positive 1. So that equals 1, which gives me 1 times a equals negative 0.2. And remember, if I multiply the left side, I also have to multiply the right. So negative 0.2 times negative 1/5. And 1 times a gives me a. And I know negative times a negative is going to give me a positive answer. So 0.2 over 5, which I can divide that out. So 0.2 divided by 5, which tells me that a equals 0.04. Okay, next equation. B plus 14.5 equals 10. I see that I'm using addition. So that tells me I can use the additive inverse. And when I use the additive inverse, I need to make it equal 0, whereas the multiplicative inverse had to equal 1. So since I'm adding a positive 14.5, I want to do the opposite. So the opposite would be adding a negative 14.5. And again, I have to do that to both sides. So positive 14.5 plus negative 14.5. Well, that equals a 0, which leaves me with b plus 0 on the left side. And then on the right side, I have 10 plus negative 14.5. b plus 0 equals b. And 10 plus negative 14.5. So the larger number is a negative, so I know my answer will be negative. And 14.5 minus 10 is 4.5. So my answer will be negative 4.5. And the third one, 2 equals negative 1/5 times c. And since I'm multiplying, I want to use my multiplicative inverse this time. So remember, for multiplication, we use the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of negative 1/5 means I would want to multiply both sides by negative 5. Because we have to use the same sign. So negative 5 times negative 1/5. That equals 1. Like that. Smaller. So that equals 1. So on the left side now I have negative 5 times 2, which has to equal 1 times c. Negative 5 times 2 would be negative 10. And 1 times c is c. So that means c represents negative 10. Number 6, Lynn went hiking on 5 different weekends. The table shows the elevation changes in feet for each of her 5 hikes. I want you to fill in the missing numbers. So for hike 1, the initial elevation was 768 feet, and there was a change of negative 96 feet. So since it's a negative change, I know I went down. So 768 plus negative 96 equals 672. So for hike 1, our expression was 768 plus negative 96. Extend this out. Hike 2. So I don't know my initial elevation, but I know that I went up 82 feet and finished at an elevation of 20 feet. So that tells me that my initial elevation plus 82 must equal 20. So 20 minus 82 tells me that my initial elevation was negative 62 feet. For hike 3, we started at an elevation of positive 62 feet, and our elevation change was negative 100, which again means we traveled down. So my expression would be 62 plus negative 100. 100 is the larger number, so I know my final elevation would be a negative number. And if I'm adding a positive and negative, I can just subtract. So 100 minus 62 is 38. So that means my final elevation was negative 38 feet. Hike 4, our initial elevation was 354 feet. And I know I had to finish at positive 129 feet. So 354 plus my change must equal 129 feet. Since 129 feet is less than 354 feet, I know my elevation was negative and I would have been traveling down. So then I can just subtract 129 minus 354, which gives me negative 225. Or you could also subtract 354 minus 129, which would give you positive 225, but you know you were traveling down, so it has to be a negative 225. And then on hike 5, the initial elevation was negative 20, and there was a change of negative 40 feet, so that tells me I, again, traveled down. And my final elevation was negative 60 feet. So negative 20 plus negative 40 equaled negative 60. So B wants you to explain what each of the numbers negative 20, negative 40, and negative 60 tells you about hike 5. So negative 20 tells me that I started at 20 feet below sea level. Then negative 40 means I traveled down 40 feet. So let's highlight below. That tells me it's negative. And then traveling down tells me it's a negative number. So then negative 60 tells me that I finished at 60 feet below sea level. Which, again, that below tells me that it's negative. Okay, number 7, a scuba diver is diving at a constant rate when her team on the surface requests a status update. She looks at her watch, which says her elevation is 18 feet below sea level. 8 seconds later, her elevation is 20 feet below sea level. A, at what rate is her elevation changing? Use a signed number and include the unit of measurement in your answer. So she starts at 18 feet below sea level. So since it's below, I know it has to be negative 18. And then she's diving a certain amount. So we don't know how much she's diving, but we know that she finishes at 20 feet below sea level. So that would equal negative 20 feet. So negative 18 plus a distance equals negative 20. So we could use the additive inverse. So the opposite of negative 18 would be positive 18. And again, we have to do that to both sides. So that would equal 0. 0 plus x is x. And negative 20 plus 18 is negative 2. So that means her rate is negative 2 feet. And it was 8 seconds later. So negative 2 feet per 8 seconds. But we want our rate to be per second. So in order to find per 1 second, we would just have to divide. So negative 2 divided by 8, which would be negative 1/4. So that tells me she's traveling at negative 1/4 feet per second. B, how many more seconds until she reaches her goal depth of 50 feet? Explain or show your reasoning. Okay, so since she's already at a depth of 20 feet and she needs to get to a depth of 50 feet, so 50 minus 20 equals 30. So that means she needs to travel 30 more feet. And we know she's traveling at negative 1/4 of a foot per second. And she's needing to travel down, so this would actually be a negative 30. So negative 30 feet divided by negative 1/4 foot per second, and that would tell me how many seconds it will take her. So negative 30 divided by negative 1/4 is 120, which means it would take her 120 seconds. C, how many seconds before her team requested an update was the diver at the surface of the water? Explain or show your reasoning. So we know she had reached negative 18 feet when they requested an update. And again, she's traveling at negative 1/4 of a foot per second. So we would just divide negative 18 divided by negative 1/4, which gives us 72. So that means it took her 72 seconds to reach negative 18 feet. Okay, so that's the end of the review.